How's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. You might be surprised to be seeing another analysis video in the playlist, seeing as I had already analyzed all of them, but there are a couple of chorales that got missed out. I have them analyzed in my notes, but when I was going through titling the videos, there were a couple that just didn't pop up for whatever reason, and I couldn't find them as mislabeled videos or otherwise, so I'm having to remake them because even though the videos were likely made at some point in time, the videos are no longer on my hard drive. But with that being said, we're just going to hop right into the analysis. Du bist ein Geist, der lehret, which translates to, you are a ghost, the teacher. That's a literal translation. I'm not 100% certain if that is the accurate, symbolic, nuanced translation. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So first thing to consider is the key. No key signature. We start on A minor, we end on A major. I reckon we're in the key of A minor here. We start off with a 1 chord, like I said, and we have some passing tones, neighbor tones, not even passing tones. A, B, D, and A. Maybe there is a bit of a 2-4-2 chord going on right there without the fifth. I think it's highly unlikely, so I'm going to omit it from the analysis. A, C, E, and A. That's another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze. We have some neighbor tones as well going on here, where we are left with A, D, F, and A. So on the end of the beat, we do have a bit of a 4-6-4 chord, D minor over A, and then we have G sharp, C, E, and B. This is an interesting chord as well. I do think what's happening on the end of the beat is a little bit more indicative of what's going on. So I'm going to mark these as accented non-chord tones. And say, for instance, you were analyzing what was happening on the beat, you would analyze this as a C sharp augmented chord with a minor seventh. So 3-7 in second inversion, so a 3-4-3 chord. But I think this is more likely a G sharp diminished chord in root position 7, and I think one of the reasons why Bach is voicing it in root position, or why we're seeing a root position dominant, a root position 7 chord, it is functioning like a dominant, but the reason why we're seeing it in this context is because it's being softened by what's happening on the beat. So we have this 3 chord leading to 7, which sort of subverts or undermines the function of 4 going to 7 from the previous and. So that's kind of interesting. It's some type of combination of 3 going to 7 or just 7 by itself. But that being said, we move to a 1 chord on the next beat as we would expect. A, C, and C. 2 roots, 2/3. Kind of an interesting spelling. And on the end of the beat, we just get a rotation of the inner voices. We have C, we have E. It's still an A minor chord. No need to reanalyze. So we have kind of something interesting going on here. There are a couple ways that you could analyze it. First thing is that we could analyze this continuing in the key of A minor, but the way that I hear it with this F sharp going to G natural, I can't help but feel like this is a brief mid-phrase modulation to the key of G, and this A minor is functioning like our 2 chord. You could analyze this, like I said, in the key of A minor and call this F sharp, B, A, and D as a, you can call that a B major chord. Sorry, is that a B major chord? That's a B minor chord. So yeah, we have something interesting going on here. I think it's kind of a parallelism of what's happening in the previous beat. We have B minor, which is functioning as 3 in, or 3-7 in second inversion, so kind of like this. But I think really what we're interested in is what's happening on the end of the beat. We have, we have F sharp, A, F sharp, and D, which is not a 7 chord, but it is a dominant functioning chord, which is 5-6. So, like I said, there is some counterpoint going on here and some, non-chord tone usage that makes the harmony kind of difficult to pick out from a, macro progression standpoint. But all in all, there's a little bit of like a harmonic sequencing going on here. Under the hood, we see that there's symmetry going on the 2 and the 4 of the bar. But then we get G major on the next beat like we would expect. G, B, D, and B, tonic triad. And on the end of the beat, we have A, we have E, we have G, and we have C, which is A minor 7, root position, which I'm going to call on the end of the beat A2-7 chord. And then we have A, C, E, and C, which is just taking the same chord, removing the 7th, putting it in root position. And interestingly enough, I think this is where we go to back to the key of A minor. Apologies for the scrunched text. I should have left more space in between the systems. But this is now our tonic triad. It is our 1 chord rather than our 2 chord. So I'm going to change the Roman numeral there. Come on, Forrest, you could write it more neatly than that. I didn't even really erase it all that well. Apologies. I don't know. I've since moved since doing the original analyses, and everything that I used originally is no longer easily locatable in my possession. So I had to use this this pencil, which doesn't have as good of an eraser as the original ones I used had. But then here on the end of the beat, we have some interesting counterpoint going on. We have this G, which I feel like is an accented non-chord tone, but we also have F, A, and B natural. So if we take an aggregate of all of the tones that are contributing to the chord, I think it's A, F, A, and C. I think that that's really what's doing it. But I mean, we could also make the argument that B is also playing a role. But I think by virtue of the fact that G and B are both occurring at the same time, I think they're not contributing to the texture. Of course they're contributing to the texture. They're not contributing to the chord that's to be analyzed from what's going on in the texture on this beat if we were to extrapolate a chord for functional analysis. So we have A, F, A, and C, which is a 6 chord in first inversion, which usually is a no-no if you follow the textbook. They'll say that 6 in first inversion is kind of like a tonic triad that sounds like it's missing a correct tone, but I don't really see any problems with it, and we see it being used here in sort of a interesting half cadential context, which is what we have here. I usually look ahead and say what type of cadence we have at the end of the phrase, but I'm a little out of practice, excuse me. We have this 4-3 suspension happening over the bass here in the tenor, which leaves us with B, D, G sharp, and D, which is a 7 chord in first inversion, G sharp diminished. Very fascinating half cadence. 6-6 going to 7-6. Okay, now we're firmly back in the key of A minor, and we have perfect authentic cadence to take out the rest of the A section, for lack of a better, more granular term for the individual phrases. We have G sharp, G sharp, B, and E, which is E major in first inversion. That's our dominant in first inversion. G sharp is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we have A, E, and D. We have this interesting 4-3 suspension that's going on here, and Bach, as per usual, is playing games with us, and by the time the suspension resolves, which really it's more of an accented like passing tone than it is a suspension, but it's a 4th over the bass, and it resolves down by step, it's functioning like a suspension. But we have a B in the texture here, which again undermines the quality of the chord, but I think really what Bach's going after here is a tonic triad, especially after a dominant. We then have F, C, E, and B. I think that what we have actually going on here is what's happening on the and of the beat, which consists of D, A, and A. So this E, I think, is a non-chord tone, and this C is a non-chord tone as well. I guess also that B is a non-chord tone. It's another 4-3 suspension going on in the soprano, which leaves us with D minor in first inversion, which is 4-6. And then we have E, E, A, and C, which is our tonic triad in second inversion. We're getting ready for a cadence of some sort. But we have an interrupted 1-6-4-5 progression here, which is not atypical for Bach to do on the end of the beat or in larger meters. We'll see that Bach will take the 1-6-4-5 progression and spread it out over the span of like the latter 3/4 of a bar, but here it's subdivided. So here we have D, we have F, we have B, and we have C. So we see what's happening underneath the 1-6-4 is almost like a 2-6-5 chord, but this C in the soprano keeps us from analyzing it usually, but sometimes we see a full 2-7 chord going on on the and of the beat, or in between the 1 and the 5. But regardless, we have E, B, G sharp, and B, which is just our plain old 5 chord. And for broken 1, 6, 4, 5 progressions, I usually use a broken line. And we also have D here, which is like kind of like an enclosing 7th. We have B going up to D that surrounds the C right here, but it's a non-chord tone for our intents and purposes. And we have an anticipation here in the soprano, which takes us to our tonic A, C, E, and A, root position. All right, moving on to the next phrase. It looks like we are still in the key of A minor, and we have another half cadence. Starting things off with another A minor chord. We don't need to reanalyze since the previous beat had a minor associated with it. Passing 7th in the alto here before we get B, C, F sharp, and D. Kind of an interesting chord here. We have a bit of a suspension, like a 9/8 suspension over the bass. So we'll mark that C, which probably by virtue means that this F sharp is also a non-chord tone. And that leaves us with B, B, G sharp, and D. Looks like we're getting a 7/6 chord here, and we can typically expect a 1/6 chord after this, as 1, 7, 6, 1, 6 is a really common chord progression that we see in Bach's chorale writing. C, E, A, and C, 1, 6. Or the inverse as well, 1, 6, 7, 6, 1. We also have D, F, A, and C on the end of the beat, a bit of a subdivided chord progression here. That's 4, 7, D minor 7. Then we have E, B, A, and B, another 4/3 suspension here, but really it's this G sharp that we're looking at here as our chord tone, which makes this an E major chord, that's 5. And then we get F, E, A, and A. We could analyze this as an incomplete 6/7 chord, F major 7 without the 5th, but I think really what's happening here is what's happening on the end of the beat, so we're going to say that this E is a non-chord tone, almost preparing like a 7/6 suspension, but Bach subverts that expectation that we have from an analytical perspective and just goes down to A, which goes back up to E again, which is kind of interesting. But I think really what's happening here is F, A, D, and A, which is 4/6. So kind of interesting actually. Typically 5, 4, 6, we would expect 5, 6 here, or maybe we would expect this chord to be a 5, 6. But regardless, we see that the bass goes down, and this is actually a Phrygian half cadence. Did not mention to catch that in my initial pass through with the chorale. And then we have this next phrase going on here, where unfortunately my printer did not get the stems fully intact, but we end the phrase with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. But similar to the first phrase, we have some mid-phrase modulation going on within. So first thing we start the phrase off with is another 5 chord, so we don't need to reanalyze. And then we move to A minor, A, E, A, and C, tonic triad, root position, passing tone in the bass. And then we move to a G major chord in first inversion. I think by this point we've already moved to the key of not G major, but C major, and A minor is functioning like our 6. We then have B, D, G, and D, which is our 5 chord, the C being sort of a lower suspension, maybe a 9/10 suspension under the bass or the soprano, or a 5/6 suspension underneath the alto. Pretty interesting chord. So that'd be a 5/6, and then we get C, C, G, and E, tonic triad, root position. We then have some passing tones here, B, D, G, and E. Kind of interesting. It's another passing 3/4/3 chord. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but the fact that we've had 2 3/4/3 chords used previously in the chorale means maybe there's something more to that than meets the eye, but I'm just marking it in parentheses because it is a subdivided chord progression, and that's always to be taken with a grain of salt. And then we have A minor, A, E, C, and E, which is our 6 chord in the key of C major. And I do think this is going to be our point in which we modulate to the key of G major as well, where it turns into 2. And also with 1 going to 3, not the most common chord progression, but 1 is a launch point where in functional tonal harmony, it can go to any chord due to its stability. 3 doesn't want to go to 6, so maybe there is some validity to that. We then have some passing tones going on here where we have G, E, D, G, E, B, and E, which is a 6/6 chord, kind of interesting. I think this one is less consequential than the previous, but I'm going to leave it there because it's an analyzable chord, and that's the mood that I'm in right now, is to include the subdivided chords that are analyzable. We then have F sharp, A, and D, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, D major over F sharp, passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, passing tone in the tenor, the soprano. We have E, A, G, and C. Kind of interesting. Another subdivided chord progression, perhaps. This is a 2/4/3 chord, which is interesting because it's being used to kind of separate the 2 chord or the 2/5 chords, D, D, F sharp, and not B. It's very possible that this could be a 3 chord in first inversion, a 3/6. That takes us to 1, but I do think this B is an accented neighbor tone, and this C is actually our chord tone here, and this is just an incomplete 5/7. Apologies for the poor erasing here, everyone. This is me after having tried to analyze this with my previous notes. However, I tried to incorporate a modulation to C major here, but I just don't think it works out because the modulation feels a little too unprepared and direct. Even though this middle section has a lot of C major flavoring, I do think it's just that part of the cycle of fifths that we are in at that point, and that doesn't necessarily mean we have to leave the key. So we definitely have a direct modulation to A minor here. We start off with E major over G sharp, E, B, and B. That's 5/6. That takes us to 1, A, E, A, and C. And I was trying to draw a parallel between the previous phrase and this one, but unlike the previous phrase, I don't think we modulate. Passing tone in the bass here. This F is a little peculiar. You could say that this is a 7/4/2 chord, technically speaking, because it does resolve properly, but I'm just going to call it a 7 chord because of the ornamentation going on here. It's some type of 7 chord. We then have F, C, G, and E, this F being an accented passing tone, this E actually being the base of our chord. This would make this a C major chord over E, which is 3/6. And then we have another accented passing tone here. We have C, B, G, and E, which is just taking our chord, our 3 chord, putting it in root position and adding a 7th. So we'll just use the figured bass for that, 7/5/3. That takes us to D, A, F sharp, and D, which is a 4 chord root position, like some melodic minor. When you raise the 6th scale degree, 4 turns from minor to major. We then have passing tone, a little leap here, which is also a non-chord tone, passing tone that leaves us with E, E, G sharp, and C. Maybe there's a passing 3+6 chord. It might take us to a 4 chord in first inversion, which interestingly enough it does. It's just a different quality 4 chord. We have some cross relations here. F natural, D, A, and it's not a 4 chord. It's a 2 chord in first inversion. Second inversion, 2/4/3. B minor 7 flat 5 over F. But what we also have going on the end of the beat, we have chord tones. D, A, C is a non-chord tone, it's a little neighbor tone here. So on the end of the beat, technically what's going on here is a root position. Actually, I'm going to take that back. That is not a root position D minor 7 chord, it's missing the 3rd. If it weren't missing the 3rd, I'd be inclined to analyze it. In other words, if the chord was entirely intact. Apologies, my iPad just slipped off of my desk onto my lap. And knowing that this is a half cadence, we have a 5 chord here. E major, E, E, G sharp, and B. And of course, moving on to our last phrase, we end with a perfect authentic cadence, as we expect most chorales to do, and it's still in the key of A minor, so nothing particularly interesting here. We have C, A, C, and E, which is A minor in first inversion, 1/6, passing tone in the alto. We have F, we have D, we have A, we have D, that's D minor over F, which is 4/6. Passing tones in the lower voices and the melody. We have E, E, A, and C. It's A minor in second inversion. Passing 6/4. We then have D, F, G sharp, and B. That's G sharp fully diminished 7th over D, which is 7, 4, 3. F is a chord tone, D is a chord tone, A is not, and A is also not a chord tone. So here we have D minor over F, which is a bit of like reverse function here, which is another 4-6 chord. We would expect 4 to go to 7, not the other way around. In the videos, I believe I called this, or at least earlier in the journey, I was calling this transitive harmony, where if 4 wants to go to 7, that same voice leading could take you backwards, and Bach does that quite a bit. It's obviously more common for him to follow the functional harmonic model that we tend to see in music of his time, but sometimes we see him go against the grain. Here we have E, E, A, and C. I do think this A is like a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and really what we have going on here is a bit of an interesting counterpoint here. It is some type of 5 chord. Technically, it is a 5-4-2 chord if it resolves and the bass changes. Actually, what am I talking about? That is not what's happening. Apologies. We have a 4-3 suspension here. We have E, E, A, and C. It looks like a 4-3 suspension over a 5 chord. That is a 1-6-4 chord. I'm glad I caught myself. And what we have on the end of the beat is an interruption of that 1-6-4 going to 5 with a little bit of non-chord tone action. We then have E, D, G sharp, and B. That's 5-7. Sometimes we use the bracket. It's just a habit from studying the textbook. And then we have an anticipation in the tenor and in the melody, taking us out with an A major chord, A, C sharp, E, and A. It's very common for Bach to end his minor chorales with A major perfect authentic cadence using that Picardy third. All right, so takeaways for this particular chorale that I have written down in my notes here are, we have, let's see, a couple of interesting things going on here in the first phrase with some mid-phrase modulation, as well as in the third phrase. And we also have a bit of tonal ambiguity going on, which is a byproduct of being in this sort of section of the cycle of fifths, especially in minor, because it feels like we are in the relative major, but in this case we're not, because the modulation is a little difficult to rationalize in terms of C going to A minor using traditional language. You could analyze it in here with some type of direct modulation, or even say this E minor sort of sound going on at the end of that bar there is A minor dominant, but I think it's more likely that we're just staying in the realm of A minor and it just sounds on the C major side of things. And we also have a Phrygian cadence, which is not entirely uncommon. I think something along the lines of 4% of the cadences in all of the chorales are Phrygian half cadences, but nonetheless, it's still something that makes this chorale quirky. And we also see the use of 3-4-3 quite a bit more than we're used to, at least. Or just chords that are in 7 chords that are in second inversion in general. 2-4-3, 7-4-3. I think that's everything that I want to talk about in today's chorale. Like I said, I do have another chorale that I have not analyzed. Apologies for the camera shaking. I don't know why. I don't feel anything tremoring in my apartment, but I don't know. I guess the camera's more sensitive than I am to that sort of thing. Regardless, thanks so much for watching the video and continuing to support the channel. If you enjoy the content and are interested in Bach chorales and content that's coming out in the future, feel free to like the video and subscribe as well. And on that note, I hope you take care. Have a good day. See ya.